Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Parapsychology and Anomalistic Psychology, Research and Education. As you know, the course started January 5th, not too long ago, and will go through with live classes until February 14th, 2015, online at WizIQ, and the materials will be available for a long time after that. First, I'd like to acknowledge that the Parapsychology Wordle at the top of the page was created by Radiant Skies, an artist on 123rf.com, my favorite stock photo and illustration place, and was purchased for the use in this course. I'd also like to thank the Parapsychology Foundation and its president, Lizette Coley, who have partnered with us not only to help support the work that Carlos and I are doing organizing the course, but also to issue the certificates of completion to those of you who are intending to get one. In addition, I'd like to thank Natasha and Jonathan Chisdis of chisfilm.net and Dr. Phil Morse of www.compellingevidencefortheafterlife.com for also helping to support the course by donations. As you can see, here are all of our speakers for the entire course, and this is our speaker for today. We are going to hear from Dr. Edwin C. May, and the title of the talk is The Multiphasic Model of Precognition. Dr. Ed May was trained in low-energy experimental nuclear physics and earned a PhD in 1968 from the University of Pittsburgh. Except for a postdoc at the University of California at Davis, he has devoted his career to the serious study of extrasensory perception, or ESP. In 1976, he joined the ongoing CIA-funded program at SRI International, and in 1985 became the contract director in what has become known as the Stargate program, the U.S. intelligence community's use of ESP during the Cold War. The research continues now at the Laboratories for Fundamental Research. Ed and his colleagues have published over 50 papers in peer-reviewed journals on the evidence for, the applications of, and the potential mechanisms for psi. So, here you go, Ed. Take it away.
We'll spend the next 45 minutes or so together. This is called the multiphasic model of precognition. There have been lots of other models about how ESP might work, and my colleague Sonali Bhatmarwa is going to give a presentation later on in the course on Patanjali and the yoga with regard to ESP. And as you'll see, how we divide up and try to understand how precognition might work. Let's see, I think I can make a pointer. Yeah, there we go. All right, the next slide. Problems for theorists. If you're ever going to do work in theory, you better have some idea what data it is you're trying to explain if you have a theory. So what are the observables? Information originating at some distant point in space-time and becomes available to a participant. Let me translate that into everyday language. Can you imagine sometime next week, Nancy Zingroni and Carlos generate a target next Wednesday, and that's down in North Carolina, and here I am up in Virginia right now, or someone off in India. That information becomes available to you. That's what we mean. How does that information get from North Carolina next week to here and now? That is a pressing problem we hope to be able to at least shed some light on. Eventually it's reported as some form of cognition. The information gets here and you report it, and there's a whole host of ways one can analyze that kind of thing and hopefully to understand it. We use a reductionist approach. I'm happy to use a reduction approach as long as it continues to work. And when it stops continuing working, we'll abandon it. But that's what we're using right at the moment. We've divided up the problem space in two non-overlapping domains. If the rest of this model all turns out to be BS, and that remains yet to be seen, there's one part I think is very, very, very helpful. And that is, how does the information get from over there tomorrow to here and now? That is strictly a physics problem. We call that the physics domain. And then once the information gets here and gets inside the head, then that we are calling the neuroscience domain. And what's nice, as you'll see here in a moment, they don't overlap much. There must be some form of getting the information inside the head, and there must be, we call it transducer. It's kind of like a psychic retina, not a real retina, but a psychic retina, if you will. Okay, so here's how it might work with the physics domain. I'm getting email blasting in here. Just let me get rid of these things. Bear with me a second. They're overlapping some stuff. Okay, so here's a hidden, distant, anomalous cognition stimulus, a target in a remote viewing experiment. What comes next? Okay, Nan, it isn't quite right. The signal comes from some hidden distant stimulus, and it comes into a person. This space-time thing should have been over here, and it isn't. Not to worry. Regardless of the mechanism, it does not depend on the characteristics of the person. This is everything outside the head. So that person could be an atheist, a Buddhist monk, a stockbroker, a skeptic, or even Sonali's daughter, Alicia. That turns out who that lovely face belongs to. What follows is a plausibility argument of how this mechanism might work. That is, how the information gets from there then to here now. It's based upon entropy, and this was first published, Brian Greene, professor of physics and mathematics at Columbia University, presented an interesting interpretation of information, the nature of space-time. Brian's website is given there, and 4-minute segment edited from the YouTube, and that's the YouTube URL right here. And we'll just take a look at this video because it'll inform us as to what entropy is and how it is in fact to time. And time, of course, is very important if you want to understand how you get information from the future. Okay, great, thank you. A measure of disorder, all you have to do is look at my desk and you've got a really nice viewpoint of what a measure of disorder looks like. But that turns out to be very important, as you'll see now. First, the data, what is it? Inspiration, a class of anomalous cognition, that's what AC stands for, remote viewing. Spying missions never failed. They all represent, and I'm not exaggerating about that, never failed, represented large change in thermodynamic entropy going from order to disorder at the various target sites. And this is a reference which I think Nan can post somewhere so you don't have to copy it all down here, of a paper published in a book and in a publication in the Journal of Parapsychology. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. A above-ground nuclear explosion, I just showed that from the web, but that for underground nuclear explosions, you have a very ordered chunk of uranium and all of them kablooey. And kablooey is a technical physics term, and you get the idea. We've now done 7 laboratory studies showing that a persistent correlation with the change of entropy of the target system and with the quality of remote viewing. And there's again another paper you could look up. That is, somehow, remote viewing, anomalous cognition, ESP, however you want to name it, correlates with large changes of entropy of the target system. The bigger the change of entropy of the target system, the better the remote viewing. And in there must be a clue. Let's go on and see. Preliminary result of an ongoing study we're doing just now, showing promising results that anomalous cognition is significantly enhanced for target stimuli of natural sites when liquid nitrogen is dispensed at the site, an entropy bomb, so to speak. And that is when the liquid, fairly ordered, turns into a gas, which is totally disordered. And at the end of this talk, I will show you some examples of what the statistics are of that particular ongoing study. Entropy and implication for anomalous cognition. Changes of entropy connect bidirectional time at the macroscopic level, reversing all those pieces in the drop of the glass that Brian Greene showed you, to the apparent single direction at the macroscopic level. Wouldn't we all like it if time went backwards and we could get young again? Anomalous cognition, in particular precognition, seems to correlate with changes in entropy of the target stimuli. Criteria for the physics domain. If we're going to understand how the physics domain works, what are the criteria? There are no examples, and I mean none, of information transfer of which one can do work, in other words, basically use it, do work as a physics jargon term, that do not have a concomitant energy carrier. For example, we're holding a conversation together in the room. I can influence you to go open the door or get me a glass of water. that sound is vibrating in the air and it comes to your eardrum, and you can then actually act upon that information. In the same way, if I can see you, you can give me some sign language and I can go do the same thing. So information, therefore, with light, travels on electromagnetic waves. So it's unlikely that anomalous cognition will be the first ever counterexample. The physics domain must include an energy carrier of some sort. That's one of the criteria that we're starting with. This is a major underscore capital letters challenge. Precognition data show a connection in space-time to space-like separated points, non-inferential future. What I mean by space-like separated, that's just a fancy physics way of saying, hey, it hasn't happened yet, it's in the future. So a putative energy carrier of 1 must be capable of propagating from the future to the present. This too is one huge, major, big challenge, of which we don't quite have much of an idea. Entropy and our multi-dimensions may, and I underscore may, provide a solution. Let's look at that a little more closely. Mainstream physics, the supremacy of entropy. In current cosmology, the concept of entropy has been gaining ground. Using only entropic ideas from entropy, this guy, Ferlinda, derived the classical dynamic equations of Newton, including Newton's gravitational equation. They were also able to describe Einstein, or derive Einstein's field equations of general relativity, an entropic force, and even suggest that gravity be replaced as one of the 4 forces of nature. And there again is a reference if you want to look at the geeky science of it all. And actually, as an aside, many people in parapsychology are psychologists. And we've recently in physics downgraded the planet Pluto in astronomy from a planet to something less. And so poor Pluto's having a bit of an identity crisis. Oh, and now, if this is true, and gravity gets downgraded from one of the 4 basic forces, gravity, electromagnetic, strong and weak nuclear forces, gravity itself will have an identity crisis. So there's a whole new field of psychology opening up to help these physics concepts deal with their identity crisis. Okay. Given a force, then it acting through some distance is equivalent to energy. Could this type of energy be the carrier for anomalous cognition? That's an open question, and it may or may not be true. Entropy gradients have also been used extensively. We didn't invent this kind of idea to understand traditional forms of information transfer, both in the visual system and the acoustic system. And here's a formal paper that describes what's going on in the audio spectrum range. Entropy is a concept that just goes across all fields of science and looks like it may be going across ESP research as well. Here's one that actually makes my brain hurt, and that is wormholes in information and higher dimensional space. Yikes! Particularly wormholes have never actually been observed, although they're predicted in general relativity. One very far out idea from mainstream physics is the notion that it may be possible to transfer information from one space-time point to another, which is space-like separated, in other words, coming from the future. And here are a bunch of papers. I would not recommend looking at these papers at all. I've looked at them and they put me to sleep just reading the abstract. They are very geeky, hardline physics papers, and I put them up here not to brag about my knowledge of physics, but rather to demonstrate that this is serious stuff. These are mainstream, important published papers in the mainstream about the fact that there might be wormholes transmitting information. Transformation via wormhole. That information is a tangible entity, independent of the object that it describes. That a medium for information transport exists in a higher dimensional space. Now, this is really stretching my own credibility here, to me at least. But at least there's an idea in physics, which is that unless physics specifically forbids something to happen, then the idea that thing is mandatory to happen. It doesn't mean it's likely to happen, but at least if it's not strictly forbidden, it can happen. So this opens the door for some smarter cosmologists than I to look into more detail. Physics domain conclusions. Although the concept of entropy, arrow of time, and information are all connected, these notions are highly speculative at this moment as candidates for the physics domain part of the model. With the carrier precognition information, precognitive information is even more speculative. Through wormholes in hyperdimensional space? It might be. Once the information is somehow in present time, how it gets into the central nervous system remains a major mystery, and the requirements for the transducer that takes that energy and converts it into something that the brain can understand will depend upon what the transfer mechanism actually is. So here's an idea of the neuroscience domain. This was the picture that was screwed up earlier. We have a target system randomly generated in the future. Somehow that information gets to current time, and it gets involved here maybe in the sensory systems, we don't know, and it gets connected here to Alicia. What happens next? There's a transducer, which we don't know much about, which converts that energy into electrochemical energy that the brain is used to dealing with. And then there's, as we will see later on, a synesthetic and implicit learning that may involve bringing this information from unconscious up to a cognition. And lo and behold, she reports what the target system was. This is a quickie view of the entire model, and we'll now examine these things in kind. So what do we know about the transducer? The short answer, absolutely nothing. And the reason for that is that we don't know what the transfer mechanism in the physics domain is. How does that information get from there then to here now? We don't know much about that, so this is all speculative. And the major portion of what we're now going to describe in terms of the neuroscience domain is due to my co-author on this paper, Sonali. She has really dug into the neuroscience part of this. How can we gain insight into its operation, solve the pressing problems of the physics domain, energy carrier, information through the carrier, through the future to the present? And we're a long way off from doing that. Okay, the neuroscience domain, psi data observations. While everyone may have some psi ability, there are relatively few superstars, and we all know who some of them are. So we need a system that places a limit on the people. In other words, what we're doing here is creating a set of criteria that must be fulfilled if we're going to have a model in the neuroscience domain. This is one of them. There's no stable central nervous system correlates with psi. Now, many of our colleagues will complain bitterly about this. What I mean by that is, oh, gee, there's alpha rhythms and people have seen correlations, but they move around on different electrodes. There are quite a bit of EEG work, but the fact is it has not yet been shown to be predictive, and it moves around. So we call that no stable central nervous system or brain correlates with psi. In 1977, we found correlation with alpha, but that information moved around across different leads unpredictably and went away and would come back again and so on. That's what we meant by no stable. Radin, Bierman, and others use presentiment in ENG. However, experimenter psi may not yet be ruled out. I don't know if Dean would agree with that, but nonetheless, it's our model. The SRI team in 1996 looked for but did not find what's called event-related desynchronization, alpha blocking. What that means is everything that we know that humans do. First of all, a brain in idle, close your eyes and relax, a brain in idle is producing this alpha rhythm, about 10 hertz, about 10 cycles each second. And everything that we know about interrupts that. If you get jabbed with some sort of stimulus, a light or a loud noise, or somebody pokes you in the ribs, the alpha rhythm goes away momentarily. If you have a thought, the alpha rhythm goes away, or if you move a muscle, the alpha rhythm goes away. So in that study, we assumed, well, since everything we know about makes alpha go away, maybe psi itself does. And we did this very careful experiment, and sure enough, we had lots of psi, but the alpha still was there. Big problem. So, no stable personality correlates with psi. And again, most of our colleagues will complain bitterly. There's some excellent work at the University of Edinburgh with Kathy Dalton showing that things like Honorton showed that extroversion correlates with the Ganzfeld and shows that creativity correlates with the Ganzfeld and so on. The problem with that is, at least with the Ganzfeld, it looks like it is an artifact with the data collection. In other words, if you are going into the Ganzfeld experiment and you're being asked to reveal your innermost thoughts to total strangers, well, extroverts are pretty comfortable about doing that. Introverts are really crummy about that. They don't feel good about it at all. And even Honorton thought that was an artifact. Okay. At the remote viewing, internal referencing personality assessment developed behavior correlates with remote viewers. In other words, introverts, for the most part, or internal referencing people, do much better at remote viewing than external people do. And again, we think that's an artifact of the collection methodology. So we tend to say that there's no stable personality variables either. So our model must account for that as well. 3 neuroscience observations that might meet these observable. Perception of signals from an information carrier. There's a variability in normal sensory range. In other words, some people have bigger, larger visual acuity than others. Some people can see more into the shorter wavelengths or longer wavelengths than others. And like any other human-mediated physiology, there's kind of a bell-shaped curve here, as you can see. And maybe out here at the end, there are some folks that are exceptional in that regard. Cortical hyperassociative mechanisms, that's gleaned from the cognitive neuroscience literature, permit the processing of information acquired from an extended sensory variability through a currently unknown transducer to a synesthesia-like coupling, following which the implicitly acquired data are further processed by the brain. Okay, that's a very complicated statement. What it actually means is, look, perhaps that if you have, let's say, extended visual system, we are not proposing, oh, I don't know how that happened, Nancy. Can we get rid of that? Thank you. Following which, okay, so what this that last little sentence means in more careful language is that, look, suppose you can see slightly into the infrared. We are not proposing that is the mechanism by which psi happens. There are lots of reasons why electromagnetic carriers are not the carrier of psi, but nonetheless you have that extended sensory capacity. Perhaps that is what is connected to the unknown transducer to allow that information through the transducer to get into the normal system. Precognition data arrives at a conscious cognition for reporting, eventually. So let's see how that happens. Here we have the same thing you've seen before, and we have the transducer, which we were just talking about. We don't know much about it. The transducer may be particularly sensitive to an extended sensory range. That's just repeating what I've just said. It converts it converts the psi carrier to electrochemical signals that must reach traditional CNS structures. So how can we gain insight into this operation? Solve the pressing problems of the physics domain, the energy carrier, and the information flowing on that carrier from the future to the present. Those are minor big problems. In fact, right now they seem daunting at least. Okay, what is the hyperassociative cortical mechanisms as seen in synesthetes, people who experience synesthesia, permits processing extended bandwidth signal? How does that work? The synesthesia-like hyperassociation mechanism accounts for the lack of uniformity in psi ability across the population. If you look at, not everybody's a superstar at psi, maybe everybody has some aspect. If what we are posing here in these two paragraphs turns out to be true, it would limit the number of people that are really superstars at being psychic. Note, synesthesia experiences do not require external signals. This is purely an internal interpretation of the sensory data coming in. Hence, psi ability is not synesthesia per se, but shares similar underlying mechanisms. Let's look at the correlations between the two. Cortical hyperconnectivity examples, for example, are absolute pitch. In other words, some people can walk out there and sing a middle C or an A above middle C. Hyperconductivity in bilateral superior temporal lobe structures linked to absolute pitch. There's some recent research that just happened a few days ago about this. Savant skills and exceptional creativity are related here. Synesthesia is present in about 4% of the population. Shares much in common with ordinary perception, relies on common perceptual mechanisms, and may merely represent an augmentation of normal propensities for cross-modal interactions. So let's see what the correlations are. Perceptual experiences normally associated with one sensory modality may be elicited by stimuli represented in another modality. You're seeing a number and you smell it, for example. Okay, let's do a rough comparison. AC is anomalous cognition. Synesthets are present about 4% of the population. Well, this is a swag. I don't know if you guys know what a swag is. A scientific wild-ass guess, but it's roughly about that. We've done some work at SRI, and it's not totally out of the question that that's a small portion of the population. Induced automatically. It's induced automatically, psi. Permanence and regularity of experience. Permanence and regularity of experience in the anomalous cognition gifted individuals. Take experience for granted. Well, maybe some of them do and some of them don't, so that's a big question mark there. It shares much in common with ordinary perception. Neuroscience domain shares much in common with ordinary perception. So the comparison between synesthets and AC gifted are at least compelling, if not absolutely true. So here's the whole thing again. This is the neuroscience domain, and this is the physics domain. Just to remind you where we are. Now, there are lots of other models in psi research. And the question is, where do they fit in? Here we have the physics domain, entropy and hyperspatial connections, a transducer right here. Stage one is this, psychophysical variability, so it converts this stuff into something through the hyperassociative mechanisms, can convert it into a cognitive processing and eventually reported by the participant. So many of the models fit into here. The first type model by Carpenter, restoration of time symmetry by Bierman, observation theories by Holt-Cooper, and model of magnetic information by Fadlukadu. All these models, which are really interesting models, by the way, are really dealing with how we convert our experience into something we can report. Only the cognitive processing stage can yield external information. In other words, what goes on in here, you can't report this stuff, but you can report this stuff here. Okay, the multiphasic model of precognition at a glance. Here we have sensory variability, and there's a little picture of it. Here are people that have synesthesia, experience synesthesia. And here are people that are good implicit learners, can look at, unconsciously see patterns in complex data. And the question is, and it's a lovely question, is maybe right there where there's an intersection of all these three things are people that have strong AC ability. This is a prediction, and we'll see now what other predictions are in the model. But first, I would like to show you one example of the ongoing experiment. Here's the tasking. And please forgive this typo right here. I say to the participant, please access and describe the first thing you see when I remove the blindfold in about an hour from now, and you'll see what we do with the blindfold. The protocol. The tasking comes. Data collection and entry into a fuzzy set. I won't go through what I mean by a fuzzy set. It's a way to incorporate what the person said so the computer can deal with it. A random target then is generated afterwards, and that target's been pre-coded in its own fuzzy set, and that allows us to compute the accuracy, in other words, what percent of the target was accurately described by the participant, reliability, that what percent of what the person said was correct, and the product of those two are called a figure of merit. So we secure the data in the cloud and then the intended target is told to me, and we wait until the message saying the outbounder has left the site. I then blindfold the participant, and off we drive to the site and stand at a predetermined place. I remove the blindfold so the person then can see and fulfill the tasking. So what does one trial look like? This is from Nevin Lance. He said crosshatch pattern, so on and so on. He says he's looking at whatever it is to a chain link fence. You won't be able to read that, I suspect. And he has a tower, there's this chain link fence and a whole bunch of stuff, a gossamer-like tower arrangement, man-made. When my colleague Lori Howley and I chose the site, that's what it looked like. Didn't have a chain link fence. But when I took Dr. Lance to the site for feedback, there was the chain link fence, and none of us knew that it was there. He had to stare through this chain link fence at this gossamer-like tower, and of course, it was pretty good. All right. But here's the results. This is the halfway mark. We're halfway through the study when I did this. The green bars, this is called the figure of merit. Good remote viewing at this end, crummy remote viewing at this end. So the farther to the right this data are, the better the remote viewing, and the farther to the left, the crummier the remote viewing. And there are two conditions: one where the outbounder pours liquid nitrogen, an entropy bomb, and one where they don't pour anything at all. And what's fascinating about this, you do not need statistics to see this effect. The green bars are clearly visually to the right of most of the red bars. In fact, the difference in the means, here's the mean for the red bars, the mean for the green bars. Statistical analysis shows that they're a 0003 p-value, but most importantly, a 0.64 effect size. And if you know what that is, it's just astoundingly large, much larger than I possibly could imagine it. And this thing over here compares the two distributions, not just the means, and it's even better. To have an effect size of something brand new like this at 0.8 is just unheard of. Frankly, I thought, well, maybe a check to see if something's going wrong with this experiment, but it looks like, should this hold up, and so far it is, that entropy bomb is like asking somebody to describe what's in a dark room with their eyes and walking in and turning on a flashlight. This is an entropy flashlight, an entropy light, or an entropy flashlight in a dark psychic room, and it allows viewers to get better information about the target. So it looks like we're on the right track. That one example with Nevin in the tower, it turned out it was the best non-nitrogen pour there was, which was too bad. So that's it. We hopefully are on the right track. Please feel free to email me at any time with regard to this. It's fairly complex. We went through it in some detail. And shortly, I think we may have some good news that this model is being accepted by a mainstream journal. And when that happens, I'll have Nancy report it to everybody. Thank you very much. Nan, we're done.
Oh, my goodness. We had some really good questions, and I would invite Trevor and I've forgotten now who the other person was. If you guys would put your questions into the chat, we can pose them to Ed and
oh, thank you, somebody.
And see what he says. Yes, you're getting a lot of claps and smiley faces. Okay, Tom Barrow says, how do they know what location they are trying to see with the blindfold?
Oh, okay. That's a real good question, and it's really a measure of how crappy my presentation was, because I don't blindfold them when they're doing the remote viewing. They do the remote viewing, and I task them by saying, tell me now, in words and in drawings, the first thing you see when eventually I remove the blindfold. So what do? We drive around the Bay Area to a predetermined site that was chosen randomly. And I walk them up to the site with their blindfold on, and everybody thinks I've got a blind person with me. And I orient them in the right direction. It's all predefined, and I aim them, say, at that tower, and then they remove the blindfold. And so they are trying to look into their future to see what it is they themselves are looking at the moment the blindfold's removed. And the reason we did that is when you're doing outbound sites, and let's say we were driving Nevin to this really kind of boring water tower, right? And on the way there, we passed some giant hotel that was on fire, and the fire trucks were there and all that. I didn't want that information to get into his remote viewing. So he's blindfolded, does not see anything along the travel path till we get to the actual site. So that's why we do the blindfold.
a couple of people were asking whether or not you've ever done experiments in which people are remote viewing.
Of course, yes. In most of the remote viewing studies, the target system exists in real time or in ancient time. Stephen Schwartz has written a couple of books. One of them is called The Secret Vaults of Time, where he reports a great deal of work. We didn't do it, but a great deal of work on psychic archaeology, where you're looking for ancient tombs and that sort of thing. So other people, not so much us, have looked specifically into the past.
Barry Cooper is asking, is synesthesia more common in young children, or do they grow
Synesthesia?
out?
I don't know, to be perfectly blunt. I have not looked into all the synesthesia literature. We have the Handbook of Synesthesia, and frankly, I haven't looked much at it. I'm a little bit out of my domain. I'm a physics guy, and this stuff makes me brain hurt. So I don't think you actually grow out of it. If you look over YouTube, you will find I think it's a BBC presentation called Brain Man, not Rain Man, but Brain Man. And this fellow is a synesthete, and it is absolutely astounding what he can do. So look it up if you get a chance.
Yeah, I'll see if I can find it and put it into the playlist for the course. David Hopkins is asking if your outbounders, your outbound viewers, are perceptive to ESP. Wouldn't the blindfold not?
That's a fantastic question, because early on the project at SRI, keep in mind, we weren't doing research just for the fun of it. We were trying to do research to improve psychic spying during the Cold War. And so one of the first questions we had to ask, do you actually need to have someone standing there, or a witting or unwitting participant, so that the person here can see remotely through their eyes? I mean, that would be an important thing to check out. And it turns out that the outbound experimenter is completely superfluous, that remote viewers see things that the outbounder does not see, remote viewers see things, or the outbounder sees things that the remote viewer doesn't see, and so on. And so it's just a way to demark a location. And my colleague Lori Howley, who's a professional photographer and helped us choose some of these sites, I said, you know, you're superfluous. So she goes there. Her job is simply to pour liquid nitrogen, or not. She only stands there for 10 minutes, but she stands and looks at the same spot. It doesn't matter. So I think the outbounder, at least this experiment, is not a participant in the process. Now, one last thing. There was a study at Edinburgh University in Scotland examining the role of a sender in Ganzfeld. And what they found out, it's more complicated than this, but what they found out is the sender is not a necessary condition for excellent Ganzfeld ESP.
Right. Annabelle is asking, could biophotons be included in the physics domain as a means of transporting?
No, and I'll tell you why. If photons, what the origin of them, biological systems can emit photons. First of all, there's all kinds of ways in which photons can't get through steel walls, Faraday cages, or we've done experiments on submarines 100 feet underwater. Biophotons or no other photons are going to get there.
Okay. Jeff Reitzman is asking, is the current modeling relegated to only the inside? I'm not sure. Jeff, can you write that again? Because you're talking about, I think you're talking about inside and outside the head. Could it be possible if it's a combination of both?
Okay. There's an old idea, and perhaps Sonali can comment if she's up and commenting about this. It was initially thought in antiquity that the way the sensory systems work is that that some aspect of vision reached out and grabbed the information and brought it back. Of course, we know, at least in the sensory systems we're familiar with, that is not the case. Information gets, I can see Nancy on video because light bounces into the camera and then E&M and blah, 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 and eventually it produces photons out of my computer screen and hits my eyeball. Now, it might be, I can't rule it out, but I'm a lazy physics guy, and if I don't have to invent something new, I don't, unless I'm forced into it. So what is clean about the two domains is that we are using analogies with all the other sensory systems and positing as a very solid axiom that you can't mix the two domains.
Mike is asking, do you think there's a correlation between your energy carrier and what astrophysicists call
Have not a
energy?
clue. Not a clue. It'd be nice if dark energy were away. Well, nobody knows what dark energy actually is. And so, hey, I'm happy to have one weird thing describe another weird thing, but right at the moment, there's no evidence for it.
Eduardo is asking, does the pineal gland have any role in this, in the transduction of energy?
Well, I have absolutely no idea. I mean, that would be something to look at. The problem is, that's a great question, by the way. Let's look at a little more detail. Suppose you say, okay, we use functional MRI, all right? We use functional MRI to determine whether the pineal gland is involved in the detection of ESP. The problem is, we don't know when you put somebody's head in the scanner and ask them to be psychic. The problem is they were psychic in the parking lot. and good remote viewers do not have control over when they're getting the information. And unless until we can figure that out, answering that question experimentally, which is a marvelous question, is extremely difficult to do because we don't know when the psi is actually happening.
And Ramses is asking, there's a hypothesis I read in Dr. Braden's book that says that precognition and PK may be the same thing, as at this point we can't really know if we are getting information from the future or affecting a variable in the present to generate the particular future. What would you respond to?
That's also a good question. Most of the PK experiments and I will caveat this in a moment, most of the PK experiments used statistical inference measures to see what's happening. You know, rolling of dice, random number generators, and so on. It isn't the case that you roll a die and it comes up 6 every time the person wants it to come up 6, which you don't need inferential statistics to see that. And as long as there's inferential statistics to determine this, there is an alternative for what looks like PK. It's still psi, but it may not be PK. And I think one of the first people to look at that was Rex Stanford in what he calls PMIR, with his dreadful name, excuse me, Rex, but the dreadful name, psi-mediated instrumental response. It sounds like physics jargon. But August Wood and Jessica Utz and I came up with a cleaner version of that called decision augmentation theory. And what that allowed us to do is to demonstrate that the random number generator data to date, and the global consciousness people, it turns out to be informational. So that door is still wide open. But if someone, you know, levitates the ceiling or bends some titanium bar in a pretzel, you know, then I doubt that's precognition.
Okay. Ray is asking, did you ever change the destination from the target given in the blind envelope to see if the outbounder session still worked?
In this study, no. We actually did that in a study. It was kind of interesting. We had one of our good remote viewers. There were 2 target pools of 6 targets in each of the 2 pools. And the participant was told for sure they were getting the wrong feedback. Okay. That there was an intended target, and they were told randomly chosen some other target, all right? And of course, the outbounder went to the intended target. And my job, I was the judge in those series, my job was to determine which was the real target pool and which was the fake one. I could easily do that, and what the effect of that was really curious, and I hope someone could replicate it. It's the only time in the entire SRI period where we saw displacement. And they only, I mean, it was as if they were cut loose in time, so to speak. I'm waving my hands furiously here. They were cut loose in time, and the viewer, Gary Langford, just would accurately, like hell, describe one of the targets in the intended target pool, but not the one on that day.
That's interesting. Trevor is asking, is it all brains in physics? Do you see precognition as only neurophysical without extra mind, e.g. dualist or idealist views? Yep. Is this a physicalist? Okay, and then so here you go. Is this a physicalist model of precognition?
Absolutely. I'm open to dualism, but the problem is if you don't need it, and so far we appear not to actually need it, why do it? You know, if I think this is my own bias, and I think Dr. Marwa, my co-author on this, agrees with me that it's all physics and physiology and psychology. That's it.
Okay. Barry is asking, I'm reading a book at the moment called The Divine Matrix. The author suggests that everything is connected due to quantum entanglement and also believes that there's an ether in the empty space between us. Does this make any sense?
No.
Could the ether carry ESP?
No, that's pretty arrogant of me. I'll tell you why. I think in research parapsychology, I may be the only one that spent 10 years doing quantum physics as in an experimental world. Entanglement is extremely fragile. It is very difficult to set up entanglement. Dean's in his book, and Dean's a real good friend of mine, and I've argued it intensely with him. Entangled minds? No. That there are quantum processes in the brain. They're what are called single ion transport mechanisms for calcium and sodium. And because they're single ion at a time, it's quantum mechanical. But the relationship between, in terms of entanglement, across neurons, it may exist, but they disappear in 10 to the minus 15 seconds. What that means is a decimal point with 15 zeros and a 1. In other words, a guy by the name of Tegmark was showing that entanglement between neurons goes away extremely rapidly. It doesn't, the wave functions involved in that do not extend beyond neurons. They never go outside the head. Then there are other entanglement issues in the brain within a given neuron that may last a few tens or even hundreds of milliseconds, but they don't go across neurons. And the reason for that is extremely well understood. It's called environmental decoherence. And let me explain that in non-quantum terminology. Let's suppose Nancy and I have two kids. She has a kid and I have a kid, and we go to the playground and we start pushing our kids together and we get them correlated. When my kid moves forward, Nancy's kid moves forward, and my kid goes back and so on. And this is a frictionless system, all right? This is a hypothetical thought experiment. And we slowly cut the swing set in half. Nancy takes her swinging kid to New York City, and I take my swinging kid to California. Well, if the correlation, classical or quantum mechanical entanglement, is at play, when my kid goes forward, I know instantaneously that Nancy's kid has gone forward. Oops, what I didn't know was that Nancy went and took her kid out for a pizza. And that's an analogy of what's called environmental decoherence. And a very well-known Nobel laureate, good friend of ours, and in parapsychology as well, a fellow by the name of Brian Josephson, accused me once on one of our discussion groups of being a coherence junkie. And then he invited me to give a talk in front of at Cambridge University. And I entitled my talk, The Confessions of a Coherence Junkie. It was a lot of fun.
Ray is asking, can you tell us a little bit about Hella Hamid's session at SRI where she...
Oh, that was an awful lot. I worked with Hella, as did Russell Targ. She was quite a remarkable remote viewer, but it doesn't matter. It's apparently the fact that you describe it before the target is chosen. That's what the experiment I just showed you in the 2 slides or so ago. And Sonali and I are preparing a paper on, we think, that the only form of ESP, in fact, is precognition. And you'll have to wait till the paper is finished and published before you understand our arguments. But it's damned hard to close the future door. One of the studies we did at SRI involved a tachistoscope. That's this very fancy high-speed slide projector. And we tried to hide the future from the participant. And some fraction of those trials, nobody, not the experimenter, not the subject, not the analyst, nobody knew what the real answer was. And then we destroyed all the real data. So here it is 15 years later, and we can't go back and determine what the individual response was, and still it worked beautifully.
Very interesting. Lakshmi is asking, can MRI provide a better idea on which
I doubt it, although Dick Bierman and others are looking at this. The problem with fMRI, it's a very slow process. It involves the movement of blood that either has more or less oxygen in it. So MRIs are sensitive to things that are happening on longer time frames than 10 seconds or thereabouts. So if psi lasted 1 second, you would never see it in MRI.
Trevor is asking, how does the model align with the debate?
Do we have 5 hours to go here, Nan?
Well, I can give you 2.5, but I don't know.
That's a really important question, philosophical. And there's a book coming out in June this year on that Sonali and I have edited. I think we have something close to 34 separate authors, which include mainstream people. One fellow is a philosopher from Australia named Richard Corey, addressed exactly that issue. Does precognition violate macroscopic causality? What you mean by macroscopic causality is, if I'm holding my keys above the desk, they will not drop it unless and until I open my fingers. They won't drop beforehand. And it kind of looks like at first blush that precognition violates that. Let me tell you one brief story. We used ESP to win at horse races. How we do that's called associational remote viewing. We don't have to go into that detail. And what I did was promise the remote viewer, look, tomorrow afternoon I'm going to take you to a really interesting place. That place was determined by the outcome of the horse race, of course. And we bet on the horse race based on his remote viewing and won $300. It was terrific. Now I get $300 stuffed in my pants, and I go to this guy and I say, okay, you ready to go for feedback? He says, hell no, I'm watching the football game. Just give me my share of the winnings. Now that gets really funny, and that addresses, if you can see the future, are you condemned to experience that future? All the data so far say absolutely not. If you dream you're going to get hit by a car or killed on the way to work, stay in bed. You can avoid it.
Kim is asking, have you participated in
any
studies on precognition in the dream?
Well, let me back up a little bit. We did one study with Stephen LaBerge in thinking that lucid dreaming might be a way to enhance the quality of the remote viewing. It turned out it didn't, but that was one example we did, about 20 trials.
Jeff is asking, has there been any studies done with altered states through the use of psychedelic compounds and PK?
Well, let's see. Besides being immensely illegal in this country to do that, shall we say informally with Chuck Honorton and the Gonsfeld in the 70s, we had some pretty interesting results. Namely, with all kinds of forbidden substances were tried. And what that does is create a great multimedia experience between your ears, having nothing to do with ESP. ESP was not enhanced by the substances we were using at that time.
Trevor is saying, I've read that RV results do not decrease over distance or time. Does that apply with a physical carrier?
Yep. The reason, the observable is what he said was correct. We've done remote viewing out to the planet Jupiter and beyond, and we've gotten feedback, so we know we got good stuff about it. In three-dimensional space, it is not consistent because everything we know falls off as 1 over r squared if it's radiating out in all directions. And ESP doesn't seem to do that. So how do we get around that? Well, here come those pesky wormholes. The way to avoid that is these wormhole things to tunnel through space and time.
I think you kind of already answered this, that someone was asking if you are open.
I am. Not very, but there are some. One of the real problems I wanted to say here is that there's a tendency, and I fall into this myself, and certainly my colleagues do as well. There's a tendency that says, look, if I can't think of a normal way in which something happened, it therefore must have been a paranormal way. But let me tell you, I worked with Bob Morris extensively. I know how to flip a coin to make the coin land the same way every time. It looks like it's flipping, but it turns out it's not. But it really looks like it's flipping. And so when Bob was giving his talks and teaching at the University of California at Santa Barbara, I go down there with him. I'd flip the coin and have people call it in the air, and Bob would catch it, and we would arrange with one little bit of sleight of hand, because we would know what it would land in Bob's hand, and with a little bit of sleight of hand, they could arrange for the entire class to get the right answer 10 times out of 10 flips. And they said, oh my God, PK. We said, nope, it's a trick. So to figure out, and Bob used to talk extensively, and I think you probably know more about that than I, Nancy, of what looks like PK and isn't. And there's a long story behind that in terms of definitions of what PK is, and in there lay the real fundamental problem.
Yeah, that was a big thing of his, how to identify
Exactly.
the barriers and when the barriers
Yep.
actually cease to having a normal transfer. Oh, Carolyn is asking, can you clarify, did you say that
Sure.
single ion
Anytime you have a
is
single ion, what do you mean when you say that? It's like a big lumpy sodium ion that has, a bunch of atoms in it, but it's just one molecule at a time. When you have one molecule, it is by definition quantum mechanical.
Good, okay. Trevor is also asking, are you still of the opinion that the 9/11 and global consciousness
Yes.
RNG correlations are something else other than real? Okay. And we will have Roger Nelson later on and Pierre Boncel in the course, and one of the things we've been trying to do is make sure
Let me say that Peter and Roger are good friends of mine and very smart folks, and they are currently holding that it's simply a correlation between this marvelous system of random number generators called the Global Consciousness Network, and they're just reporting correlations. And it seems to become increasingly fashionable that psi is merely a correlation. Walter von Lukadou's elegant model, the model of pragmatic information, posits that ESP is simply a correlation. That cannot be true. And the reason it cannot be true is that you cannot, by a quantum correlation or a classical correlation or correlation of any kind, you cannot get usable information by looking at just one side of the correlation. Like Nancy took her kid out to the mall, and I can't conclude anything real from my kid swinging on the swing. That's one way to think about it. So if you believe, or if the evidence suggests that you can actually use ESP information, and in our project over the years, we found lost hostages, we found lost nuclear weapons, we described underground facilities in the Soviet Union, China and Cuba and everywhere else, and we're able to act on that information. So there is information transfer. It cannot, in fact, be a correlation.
Carolyn is following up by saying, but what about boundary effects and all of the interactions in the vicinity of the single ion? Can the interactions of the ions be characterized by the equations yet? I guess I'm asking whether the brain...
Yes, in fact, that was new information for me. One of my colleagues, Joseph Depp, really a major good physicist, was saying that in a single ion, in a single neuron, you can have many single ion transport mechanisms that are in fact entangled with each other, and that entanglement lasts for tens or maybe even 100 milliseconds. His daughter did a PhD research topic on that very subject.
Yeah, lovely. Physics runs in the family. We have a bunch of people who are typing at the moment, so let's see what we get. Okay, so Trevor says, what other precognitive models do you rate which compete?
Well, Nancy, you might be able to correct me on this. I don't know any other model which actually goes directly at precognition.
Carlos says say that again? You said the idea of serial time that were specifically presented as models of precognition. How long ago?
But to me, serial time is breakfast.
That was quite a while back, he says. Okay. Sheila's asking, do you accept that subatomic particles, when separated, still have interactions?
Of course they do. I mean, they don't last forever. If one of them bangs into something, the entanglement goes away immediately.
Oh, okay. And they liked your joke. And Barry Cooper just gave the reference to Experiment with Time by J.W. Dunn. Okay. I think we're winding down. We were hot and heavy there with questions for a while. Does anybody else have a question that they want to pose?
All right. Well, thank you all for tuning in. I really appreciate it. The questions were right on target. And stay with us. It's a fascinating, fascinating field. And the richness and diversity of different viewpoints, as Nancy and Carlos have put together here, are really an excellent, excellent job. Thank you, Nancy. It's terrific.
Oh, thanks, Ed. That's really lovely. Don is asking if you have any...
That's a big one. And anomalous cognition is on there. And if they want to know behind the curtain what happened during the psychic spying race between us and the Russians, get ESP Wars. It's available on Amazon.
Oh, right, right. For some reason, it's not letting me go to the ending slide. So we'll just say I'm going to refer you back to the course schedule for the upcoming stuff next week. And I want to thank you, Ed, for this. This is absolutely wonderful. I think everybody was really engaged, and the questions and answers were quite good.
Wow.
We have this morning 748 registrants, and about 10% of them have been in this class. And the rest will be able to see this on the recording in a few hours. And Ed, you'll have your MP4 probably in a couple of days, because I'm a little behind on doing the editing of the videos and all that stuff. So thank you so much. We really appreciate your effort. And don't worry, Kim, we'll be putting up the listings of the book. We have Anomalous Cognition, Psi Wars, and Sonali's putting in links. And is there a Amazon list already for the 2-volume that's coming up? Sonali, maybe if you have that, you can pop that in there. But we will also put that up on the course feed. If you have more questions for Ed, you can put them on the course feed for the course. You just go back to the schedule, click on the title of the course, and write your questions at the bottom of the course page, and we'll make sure that he gets them. Or you can click on his name.
I'm going to be traveling for the next 2 days on my way to India, so I'll be out of touch for that period of time. Okay.
That's all right. That's fine. We'll be here till the end of February and beyond. And thanks, Tom, for copying the chat. Thank you, Ed. I'm going to shut the system down right now, and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Enjoy Charlottesville. And thanks, everybody else. I hope you have a great morning,
Goodbye, everyone.
afternoon,
Thanks
evening,
again.
and wee hours coming up after the course. Bye now.